Thank you for joining us, Suad, and being such an incredible force supporter in the background of afikra. You know how much I love you already, so I don't need to go into that. I want to introduce everybody to you and the amazing work that you do. So for those of you who don't know, Suad Amiry is a Palestinian writer and architect living in the West Bank town of Ramallah. She studied architecture at the American University of Beirut, the University of Michigan, and the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Amiry is the founder of the Riwaq Centre for Architectural Conservation. The center was founded in 1991, the first of its kind to work on the rehabilitation and protection of architectural heritage in Palestine. She is the author of many architectural and nonfiction books. Her book, Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, has been translated into 19 languages and was awarded the prestigious Viareggio Prize in Italy. Amiry has 6 or 7 nonfiction books, the last of which is My Damascus and Mother of Strangers. We are very, very happy and very excited to have Suad with us today. Today we're going to be talking about Mother of Strangers, and we assume that most people joining us today have read the story. It is based on the true story of 2 Jaffa teenagers. Mother of Strangers follows the daily lives of Subhi, a 15-year-old mechanic, and Shams, the 13-year-old student he hopes to marry one day. In this prosperous and cosmopolitan port city with its bustling markets, cinemas, and cafes on the hills overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, we meet many other unforgettable characters as well, including Khawaja Michel, the elegant and successful owner of orange groves above the harbor, Mr. Hassan, the tailor who makes Subhi's treasured English suit, which he hopes will change his life, and the very mischievous and outrageous Uncle Habib, who insists on introducing Subhi to the local bordello. So I'm going to begin with playing you guys a short snippet, an audio short snippet of from Mother of Strangers.
Subhi had followed his passion, or rather, his obsession. From an early age, he had been dismantling and reassembling everything in sight. Whether it was his grandfather's Zenith radio, his father's agricultural tools, his brother's bicycles, the neighbor's children's tricycle, his uncle's horse carriage, or his younger siblings' toys and dolls. He dismembered those toys into heads, arms, hands, legs. While the children cried frantically, older family members burst into laughter as they complimented him on his newly invented creatures, where one doll's limbs were attached to another doll's torso, or an animal head to a human body, or the like. Subhi would always restore the dolls and toys back to their original compositions, and then the screaming and yelling would stop. Subhi's father, Ismail, also called Abu Jamal in reference to his eldest son, often asked him, "Why work for Muallim Mustafa when you could work with your own father?" "The answer to your question is very simple," replied Subhi. "Muallim Mustafa pays me 30 piastres a day, while you pay my brothers nothing." "Nothing, ya ars, you bastard, nothing? Don't I give you and your siblings a roof over your heads and a mattress to sleep on? Don't your mother and your grandmother spend their days and nights washing and boiling your greasy clothes and cooking for you? You call that nothing? What else can a poor man like me do for his kids? Let's see how far your 30 piastres a day gets you. I bet you'll end up a bachelor just like your uncle." "What's wrong with Uncle Habib? Isn't he having fun staying out late in Tel Aviv most nights? Is that the kind of life you aspire to, son?" Subhi's father was referring to his youngest brother, who, in spite of the little work he did and the little money he earned, managed to lead a rather wild life in the bars and nightclubs of Tel Aviv. He also spent most of his weekends in the Arab and Jewish brothels located along the Jaffa-Tel Aviv road frequented by British soldiers and Jews. But doesn't Uncle Habib say he's making use of his good relationships with the British soldiers he meets in the brothels to change their government's policy toward Jewish immigration to Palestine? What nonsense. We see more and more ships full of Jewish immigrants arriving at the Tel Aviv port every week.
Okay, and I'm going to stop there.
What a good start, I would say.
That is a good start. And I thought we would begin like at the end, and that's something that you do with this book. You end with the beginning of the story. So at the very end, once you finish the whole book, you kind of understand how this all came together, and how this book got started, how the story got started. And it brings me to the table of contents and the chapter titles that you came up with. A lot of thought went into these. And in my eyes, like, they're the breadcrumbs and they tell the whole story, even if you were just to look at the titles of this page. I wonder, what is the significance that you felt for the descriptions, and how coming up and writing each one was, how that process was like for you?
Well, as you know, choosing the title of a book or choosing the title of a chapter is extremely important. On the one hand, you don't want to reveal too much, but at the same time, you just want the reader to get a gist of how Kafkan the situation is, in a way. And they actually, most of my titles come on their own. I don't spend much time. Somehow I feel what is the most, like a joke, what is the punchline of a joke or a story. So often when I write it, it's just the title comes up naturally, I must say. But also, as you said, I want the people from the title to figure out what is it they're dipping into.
Yeah. The first time I noticed the chapter titles was Sugar Daddy, chapter 5. I was like, okay, Suad is like playing with these chapter titles and they're really fun. But yeah, you can pretty much follow along the story just by looking at the chapter titles. That is the punchline, like you said.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about one thing, Suad, and we previously talked about this, and that is your own professional background.
Right.
How that kind of comes into play when you write and when you design the city, so to speak,
right.
in the written word. So let's talk about your ability to design the streets of the 1940s Jaffa with a pen. It's really extraordinary how well you recreate the space in this book. And here's just a snapshot of how you did that. If you can tell us a little bit about how you think your background comes into play.
Yeah, sure. I always say I have 3 hats in my life. One is a political social activist, and one as an architect, and one came later at the age of 50 as a writer. But I was really trained as an architect, and partly I have a stronger visual memory than anything else. Also, I can add that I have always liked telling stories ever since I was a little kid. So I would consider myself a hakawati. But only when I started writing, I realized, or maybe the readers made me more conscious about how, for example, being an architect or being trained as an architect helps me to reconstruct the space. For example, I never thought that my last 3 books were about cities until somebody told me, your Gold That Slept Here is about Jerusalem. My Damascus is obviously about Damascus, and this book is about Jaffa, where my father came from and where my family lost their home and their livelihood in Jaffa. So really being an architect helps me reconstruct the space. For example, when I describe the houses, or I describe the streets, or I describe the atmosphere, it's all very vivid in my mind. I always say that, I grew up as a child in Damascus, and Damascus has incredible visual impact on me. And so I always thought that I became an architect because of these images that impacted my life, the Suq al-Hamadiyya, the market of the light in the souks, the voice in the souk, the spices and the color in the souk. So all of these visual images are very, very easy for me to recall. So having such a very strong visual memory sometimes helps me. For example, the first compliment I got about my Mother of Stranger was how people felt that they are really in Jaffa before 1948. The other, I don't want to sound bragging, God forbid, but I do have a good memory for conversation. And conversation and places come together in a very natural way. For example, I met Mikey in 2016 in a cafe in in New York, I can tell Mikey what is it we discussed word to word in that discussion. So they're having this strong memory of conversation and place. I think that they come together to help me in constructing a novel or a book that I am doing. I am not very, for example, I don't notice what people wear in general. I know the style in which you wear, Yasmin, but I wouldn't recall what is it you're wearing. So when you read my books, you never figure out, except for the English suit that plays a very important role in this book, you never find me really describing people very accurately, except for the expression in their eyes, but you never know how they look. So what I'm trying to say, the novel is me. Whatever is strong abilities I have, they are there, and whatever is weak in me, they are there also. I hope I answered your question.
You did. And I actually didn't think of that, because after reading now, I realized that, I don't really know like the style of clothing Uncle Habib would wear, but still I could picture it. I could imagine how he is without you describing what he's wearing, just from the character building that you do.
Exactly.
Other ways.
Right.
That's incredible.
Right.
And another thing that I think you've worked intensely on with this book is like research and history. So it's obvious that a lot of work went into it. And you've taught me a lot. And I think a lot of my friends that have been reading this book, that's something that we kept discussing, is that, we like found out, for example, the Kulthum, just as an example of her coming to Jaffa. Some other examples are Nabi Rubin, specific things like military tactics of the mortar shells, the train wagon, the British ship Liberty, the citrus agreement, even the Palestinian currency. Like, so much detail and so much history went into this. And it made me wonder about what you knew before writing this book and how much of all of this was new to you through the research. Did you know all this before, or did you?
No, both. I also learned a lot. I also learned a lot writing this book. I have knowledge of Jaffa from my father, from my aunt. As you know, all refugees, when they leave their place, it becomes very, they're obsessed. So they keep talking about it, they describe it, but it's also, there is a lot of sadness in it. But you learn from it. What was so wonderful for me, that when my father left Jaffa, he was to study at the American University of Beirut. He was 17. And Subhi, the main character of my book, is 17. I learned a lot from oral history. Never underestimate oral history. And our people really depend on oral history. I am amazed when people tell you a story, you think that it's hacky, it's just like chatting or anything. From this book, I learned whatever I heard, whatever interviews I did, I had to sort of go back to a book to research, to find out that really most of the people that told me about Nabi Rubin, what happened in Nabi Rubin, for our readers or for our listeners here in Palestine, we used to have many mawasim, we call them festivals, that happened in the spring normally. And Nabi Rubin was one of the most important festivals in Palestine. It's close to Jaffa. Nabi Rubin is south of Jaffa. This is all before 1948, by the way. The book describes how Jaffa was before 1948. So when people tell me, I met people from Jaffa, they described to me Nabi Rubin, which was extremely important, to a point where a wife would threaten to divorce her husband if he doesn't take her to Nabi Rubin, or if the family doesn't go. Then I go around and I read, and thank God there is a lot of written material about Nabi Rubin or other things. Kulthum, I liked your pickup on Kulthum, because when I met people from Jaffa and asked them how many times, how was it like having Kulthum? Again, for those of you who don't know who Kulthum is, she's the Maria Callas of the Arab world. I mean, she's the woman that united the Arab world. I can tell you that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She died in 75. But here we are, Kulthum coming to Jaffa, to Palestine in the 30s. And many Jaffan people, Jaffan people are known to be very arrogant, and they think that the center of the world was and still is Jaffa. They think that had it not been for Jaffa, Kulthum would not have been famous. Of course, nonsense. But this is how they perceived it. But it was wonderful how the older people of Jaffa described to me how when Kulthum came, how the city went upside down. It's like having the Beatles going to America for the first time ever in their lives. Like the peasants from Egypt who lived in Jaffa came running in the street, camped for a whole night to to see Kulthum, how the mayors and every important character in Palestine. So to make a long story short, Yasmin, I have learned a lot from the people of Jaffa, actually. And everything that I had to go and make sure that it really was very accurate. And most of the time, it was extremely accurate.
Yeah, what you had told me about the oral history and in really like going to collect the archives of even my grandfather's like notebooks and things like that. I did ask my grandma, like, what do we have left of my grandpa's notebooks and things like that. He kept all his passports, any official document he ever had. But all his notebooks, they were thrown out, unfortunately. But that oral history is important. I wonder, did you come across any like physical artifacts in your research? Anything like pictures, images, or that kind of stuff? Did people that you meet show you anything? Or
not really, meaning from the people themselves, or no, there is one story in the book that you touch on, which for me was very, very touching for me even. Which is a day after the 1948, when Jaffa was the biggest city and the richest city in Palestine. As you know, it has the Jaffa oranges, and in the 40s, 46, almost 3 million boxes of Jaffa oranges were exported to Europe. So having the Jaffa oranges meant that all merchants or business people from Lebanon, from Syria, from Egypt, name it, from Algeria, Yemen, Syria, they all came to work in Jaffa. So in a way, it was this cosmopolitan city that attracted most people into it. And then in the book, we see after the collapse, the city had 120,000, and it gets bombarded for 3 days. And 3 days, the city, people start running away from the war, and the city is left with 3,000 people only. So the day after, you wake up and your whole community is gone. Your neighbors, this is Subhi who stays there. Your whole community is gone. And there is one scene that really Subhi describes, I get to know about it, is having a Palestinian passport, because people had Palestinian passport before 1948, and we had our own money, Palestinian Guinea, and so here they are. They have lots of money. They have Guinea Palestine. They have a Palestinian passport, but then they have a new state, the Israeli state, in which they realize that none of this passport or none of this money will mean anything. So you have a scene in the book in which an older man called Abu Ghalib, which means the victorious, comes close to the sea, and he's sitting on the porch, and the men are around him, and there is unemployment. They don't know what to do with themselves, and he just picks up his money, all the money, Palestinian money he has. He picks up his Palestinian passport, and he throws it in the sea.
Yeah.
And he says, this will become a museum collectors. This is for collectors. So there are moments in this book that are tragic for me.
Mm-hmm. Which in that moment, that is one of the parts which made me cry. And I wanted to ask you this question, because I'm not the only person that cried reading this book, in some parts of it at least. We laughed in other parts. Writing this, I know this was very personal and very difficult to write something this tragic towards the end. How was that emotional process? Did you cry writing at any time? Did you ever have to be like, okay, I need a break?
Yeah, of course. You know what is so amazing? I tell you something that I discovered from writing, that the reader is a barometer. The reader is so intelligent. Most probably 100%. Whenever you cried, I stopped writing, you know. Those moments, the readers pick up very, very quickly. And this I learned from Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, that the readers are really extremely sensitive. But I just want to add something for the listeners here so they can follow us a little bit more. The book is really divided. I don't know, Yasmin, if you want to talk a little bit about the structure of the book, or shall I do it now?
Feel free to do so. Go ahead.
Okay, just for them to be able to follow up. The book is really divided into pre-1948. The main character, Subhi, who is in love with this young peasant woman from Salame, everything that happens there is now before 1948. And before 1948, we managed to see how rich the city is, how open the city is, how cosmopolitan the city is, having different communities, whether they're Arabs or Kurds or Circassian or Armenians or name it, Greeks, Italians, also all sorts of Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I mean, the city was really incredibly open. And that's why it's called it was called al-Gharib, the mother of strangers. And that's where the name of the book partly comes from. Now, the climax of the book is in Nabi Rubin, where the two young people meet and nourish their love. And, you know, he's making her all sort of kites, and he fills the kites with colors. So here we have two young people in love, expecting a beautiful future. But here is Palestine, and here is Jaffa, and here the community of Jaffa living a moment of incredible richness and openness and hoping for a better future. And then the Jewish settler, the Jewish immigrants arrive under the British mandate, and they take over and over something. We see it until today, actually. I mean, it's something we know it happened in the 40s, but it's still happening now. And then the city gets bombarded. And the second part of the book, where Shams is more concentrated about Shams, we see what is the human tragedy of wars. And I am really interested because when we talk about wars, we always think that there are armies fighting with one another. It's fictitious. There was never a 1948 war. What happened, the Israelis and the British, we were kicked out of our homeland under the British mandate, before even the end of the British mandate. So for me, it's important that the listeners know that this book is really divided before and after. And I stop here because I talk a lot as usual.
Speaking, Saad, of this cutoff period where you go from before and after, I also felt like a shift in your tone in your writing. And this is one example where it just felt like, okay, gone was all he could think, gone were his family, gone were his neighbors. And I wanted to give you the chance maybe to talk a little bit about the writing style in that change, and really just how you shifted us from this like lovey-dovey, very beautiful picture that we never got to see of 1940s Jaffa into something closer to what we know.
Yeah, this prose, like, you know, some people tell me you write poetry, but I don't mean it as a poetry. It happened the first time, I think, with Murad, and second time was Golda Slept Here. And it just happens naturally. I should tell you, I never think that I am going to stop writing phrases and I'm just going to put sentences one after the other. Because so many people have asked me about this, I think now I analyzed it, then sometimes, for example, when there is a lot of tragedy in a situation, In this case, Jaffa is being bombarded for 3 days, and people are in panic, like everywhere in the world. When you have a war, when you have 30,000 bombs came over the skies of Jaffa. So people, they were panicking. And for me, this panic, I could not describe it in natural sentences of, I just felt that it has to be gun, 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 or running, 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 running. Some people go east, some people go west, some people enter the building, some people go out of the... I mean, that chaotic situation calls for this. I did it in Golda Slept Here when I described what it means for a Palestinian, what it means to feel Palestinian every 24 hours. And for me, I always say that, my problem is not only that Palestine is occupied. The bigger problem for me is that Palestine occupies me. And that occupation is very heavy for me. There isn't 1 second in my whole life that I forget that I am Palestinian. And in that, loss, I remember I just to describe what it means to not wanting to be Palestinian, it just came natural. So these things, I think maybe you can say are the most dramatic moments in the books.
Yeah, and we can tell that shift through the shift in writing. You did a good job with that. A lot of the stuff that we talked about in terms of the history background, these were true events, and in the back, everything is kind of like history and, context, but it's a historical fiction. And in this genre, the story is inspired by true events, but some are fictional. At one point where this makes the reader constantly say, is this true? Is this true? Did this really happen? Or is this part true? So one thing that kind of jumped out at me was after in the second half of the book, when Subhi was just very upset with everything that was happening, and he was really upset about the Mercedes dealership.
Yeah.
It was called Gharghour, and I remember that I've driven past this dealership in Ramallah many times. Does this have a connection?
Absolutely, absolutely. Good for you, because every time I pass the Gharghour in Ramallah, I feel good, I must say. Okay, let me say the following, that Gharghour was actually and still is the agent for the Mercedes.
The dealer, yeah.
The dealer or the agent. I mean, he's the one who imports all the Mercedes into Jaffa. I don't know if the Middle East, but at least to Palestine. And here is Subhi, young man of 17, 15, 16, 17, like all young men, are interested in cars. And of course, Subhi, being a poor man, every time in the morning when he passes, he looks at this Gharghour and see all kind of Mercedeses, and he follows on this type, on this truck, on this. And then the war happens, and of course, I mean, this is what people don't realize, that the war, how much people lose during the war. You lose your job, you lose your house, you leave your orange grove, you lose your... And for Subhi, is like, what happened to the Gharghour Mercedes cars? Who took them? Who robbed them? Because a lot of Jewish immigrants arrived to Jaffa, and also the government, the army, was stealing things. Stealing Arab homes, giving them to leaders, to military, but also the cars. So he was obsessive about who took these Mercedeses, which one is driving these Mercedeses. And I am like you, because the Gharghour family were our neighbors and our friends in Amman. So they were also the dealers in Amman for Mercedes, and they used to tell us that we started our business. But it wasn't in Ramallah. And a few years back, when it appeared in Ramallah, I was, okay, my God, there is continuity. Here they come back to Palestine as the dealers or the whatever they call them for Mercedes. It's a little victory, but it makes you feel good.
Because there are so many little stories within this story. So, are there any other tiny, like, similar things like the Gharghour dealership or agency that we don't know that might have been true, like in dividing history from fiction to non-fiction?
Okay.
Any other snippets like that worth highlighting?
I tell you, everything in the book which has to do with history or which has to do with the war is true.
Like even Cafe and Shirah, for example, the intellectuals.
All of them.
Yeah.
And I was lucky because there is a Bawab, a researcher, who wrote 2 books, and he's obsessive about all the cafes, all the orange who owned oranges. So there is a lot of information out there for you to base your story in it. Of course, the fictional is the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when Subhi, the part you picked up, when Subhi was taken to the brothel with his uncle, I sure wasn't with them in the brothel. When Subhi arrives with his English suit very proudly into this poor people's cafe, all the conversation is, I know that they were impressed, but then I have to create all what they said and how they touched him, and when he goes to the Turkish bath. So all the little details that make a story, make a novel, I sort of contributed a great deal to it. But I don't want to be challenged about the accuracy of the book because of the Israelis. Because I remember when I wrote Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, and it was, it was sold in English in Israel, there were 1 or 2 Israelis trying to discuss with me, yes, no, my son. So I am very aware that I don't want to be discredited by somebody telling me, no, there wasn't such and such Jaffa oranges. There weren't. So every single story in that book is for real. The conversation, you can say that Suad added pepper and salt into them.
Hard slices. So some of this history is still ongoing, right? And you mentioned this earlier. One thing that struck a chord with me was the discussion and the debate and the conversations that you've built in order to show multiple sides around strikes that were happening at the time before 1948. And it reminded me of the strikes that we still have ongoing from universities, being closed for months at a time to just starting semesters really late to entire towns shutting down. And I wonder, and you don't have to talk about this, you can just tell me what similarities you see from that time to this time. But I wonder what you think of this, why you chose to highlight this in depth, and why you wanted to kind of bring both conversations, both sides of this conversation in the book.
It's important for me to realize, for us also Palestinians to realize, also for the non-Palestinian who don't know much probably, that this, what we are suffering from today has started almost 100 years ago. Meaning that, the Jewish settlers, there are many immigrants. Okay, there are many immigrants to go to Europe. Many immigrants, we are not anti-immigrants as such, because I think people have to open their borders to immigrants because they are coming from wars. But there is a difference between the agenda of immigrants. For example, you have maybe 2-3 million Algerians in France. But the Algerians in France are not occupying France slowly and kicking out the French away. None of the immigrants, the Indians, we see an Indian prime minister in Britain, true. But the Israelis, the Jewish settlers, the Jewish immigrants they were Zionist, and they came to create a state above us, to create a Jewish state. And this is the problem. It's not like a state where we can share it with the Palestinian. They are coming to Palestine, which had a majority Palestinians, and they want to have an exclusively Jewish state. How is that going to happen? Let's say that we want to, the Mexicans want to go to France and make a Mexican state, exclusively Mexicans. Well, obviously they're going to kick all the French or the other way around. So the thing is, what I tried to say, that what I am witnessing now in Ramallah with the settlers in Hebron, in all over the West Bank are exactly acting the way they acted against people in Jaffa. Not only that, the 3,000 people who remained in Jaffa are in the streets today demonstrating against being kicked out of their homes. You know, from the 120,000, there were 3,000 people who remained for the last 75, 70 plus years. And today, as I am talking to you, the Israelis have decided to kick them out of their homes. So what I meant by these conversations is, one, to show the challenge that is facing us, that this is a colonial settler state that does not stop. They want to take our land and they don't want us on this land. And the conversation we are having as Palestinians, how to resist this kind of colonization, started in the 30s. We went in a big strike in 1936, in 1939, and it didn't work. We used peaceful methods because we didn't also have any weapons through all our history. We used peaceful, nothing works. So I want to recapture the similarities of what happened to us in 1948 and what's happening to us right now. That was the whole idea.
Yeah, and I think you did a good job in showing the day-to-day, just normal people, how they thought about these strikes, closing their shops, like from the mechanics to the fishermen to the orange groves, how, just how they struggled within this whole thing, like economically, socially, So I thought you did such a great job in kind of sitting us down with these people and hearing just their thoughts about how this impacts their day-to-day life and their means of living, etc.
Yeah, and also, the cafes. I did a lot of research on cafes in Jaffa because in Jaffa, there were a number of cafes and, of course, neighborhoods that are based on class. Rich people have their own cafe, and Subhi, who is a mechanic, has his own cafe. And the conversation and the divisions, for example, in the cafe in which Subhi goes, which is called tumultuous, the Fool's Cafe.
For those who don't know Arabic, what does that mean in English?
Yeah, the Fool's Cafe. All those fools go to this cafe, including Subhi. So anyway, the division in that cafe has to do with ethnic groups, whether you come from Egypt or you come from Lebanon or you come from, but they are all workers, but still they are divided into different ethnic groups. And the music they are listening is Egyptian because the majority of workers in Jaffa pre-1948 were Egyptians. While if you go to Al-Inshirah, which was the intellectual, where the mayor went and all the intellectuals and the reporters and journalists, and so you have a completely different conversation in there. So it was important for me to also give the class. In the book, I also deal with the different classes in Cairo, in Jaffa, the Egyptians being the poorest. But also I wanted to highlight in the conflict between the peasants and the urban people in Palestine, which existed from then and still exists today.
Absolutely. So between like the Fadlahin and Madaniyin, for sure. And you did this towards the end of the book as well, that even after the whole catastrophe was going on, people were still dividing themselves amongst themselves, and that whole conversation was there. So the book, Suad, is obviously on an international, it has an international platform and it's accessible to global audiences. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the publishing process in terms of what were some things that changed. And I wonder about two things related to this, from curious, like just about publishing and writing and etc. What were some things that you as a writer did not want to change and were able to hold your grounds and not changing? And then what are some things that you compromised on and just changed, listened to the editors or the publisher and all that? Yeah. And this is an image to give people context. So this image is used for the Italian version of the book, or is it the...
Yeah, the Italian and also the Arabic.
Okay, yeah.
But also the Italian and the Arabic have the same title, and English has a completely different title. And that in a way answers your question. So let me start by saying that I am really, really lucky as a writer to have editors that I have worked with for 20 years. It's the same publisher who published Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, which was my first book in Italy, or in Arabic, or in English. I must say that I have very sympathetic publishers when it comes, any publisher who's willing to allow a Palestinian voice there, have the world hear a Palestinian voice, is someone who's sympathetic to you. And that for me is extremely important. And as a result of that, I must tell you that I think partly when you are very, very honest in what you say, or very sincere in what you say, and you're not trying to make a publicity, or you are talking from heart to heart. And I am, in all my books, are really interested, even though I am a political animal, but for me, the human tragedy is the most important. What happens to human beings as a result of wars? And so I think having that human touch, and also my books, they're not all heroes. I mean, I'm very critical of myself, of my family, of the Palestinians, and there are, collaborators. Not all of us are beautiful and courageous and what have you, including myself. So in general, I think that I have very little changes when it comes to the content. Of course, there is a lot of editing because English is not my mother tongue. So we do a lot of editing to improve the English for an American or British, whatever, English speaking. However, the titles and sometimes the covers, I intervene, and sometimes they change. They change for the ability of that country to accept or not accept. For example, this book in Italian and in Arabic, it's called The English Suit and the Jewish Cow. And the Italians the Italians are Italians. They accept things very easily. In some countries in Europe, such as France, Germany, and also the United States, they are more careful when it comes to any joke about, Jews or Muslims or Christians, name it. So I think there is a little bit of oversensitivity about something. And, I always joke about everybody, about myself.
Yeah. I want to clarify this for people who didn't finish the book. It's very important. So the English suit is from the very beginning of the story, we know what the English suit is. And the Jewish cow is another element of the story, but comes later on in the book. And it's basically a cow that after the events have happened in the second half, a family, Shams's family, they find and they slaughter it so they can have something to eat. But then they get in trouble for this, and it becomes like a crime that the dad gets persecuted for. So this was pretty much the dark humor, or like the irony of the situation. And that is why I think Suad had initially, like, you named it the British suit and the Jewish cow, taking from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, and do it like just introducing your or maintaining your original kind of
Also because the robbery of the refugees who have been sitting under trees for 2 months, not having food, not having water, they had to search for food all the time, and ultimately they make this adventure of stealing a Jewish cow and slaughtering it, and then all the court and all the trial that happens for a cow. And what do we have in the background? We have a background of which major cities in Palestine, of Haifa and Akka and Jaffa and Ashkelon and everybody. The Israelis are robbing the whole country and taking our homes and our farms and our groves and everything. And here you have a trial for a cow. So also to show the tragedy or the scale of the absurdity in which we live.
And then the ripple effects of that story. There's an important sequence of events that happens after this to the main characters. Shams gets separated from her family as a cause of this. And later on, her entire life changes. Her partner in life changes. All the subsequent events relate to this event in the story.
The suit and the Jewish cow have great consequences on people's life in the book. Yeah. That's why I chose them.
Yes, and they're very intriguing. Like just when you say, they would make somebody pay attention. But anyway, I want to shift gears to like a few final points before we switch to the Q&A. And this is something I really wanted to ask you about. And that is, first, you kept things really unfiltered and you didn't really tone down for the Western reader. You portrayed everything as it is. There were even, that was just some impression that I've had. It wasn't, even though it was an international novel, you still, you did not change anything just to fit in with a Western audience. But to the long lost first love story, which is like the story of this book. And in the end, we get to Shams's words with her description of it being like Waldana, right? So she's had a very different life than Subhi. What did you want to achieve with developing this familiar tale? The emotions, the relationships, maybe the innocence, the different experiences, both ends for Subhi and Shams. Did you see this story as something familiar to your maybe own teenage escapades or, friends' teenage escapades, and just that kind of first very innocent tale that we all are familiar with?
Yeah. No, okay. You have 2-3 questions.
I didn't ask any question. I just blurted out to you all this stuff.
You have 2-3 questions in one. Every time I concentrate on one, I forget the other. I start with the first. No, I'm joking. I have a good memory for conversation, remember. Listen, first of all, I think the worst thing that a reader can do is make compromises. Really. Books push themselves. I should tell you that I was writing a completely different book when I started, when circumstances happened that I should write this book. This book was pushing itself. I left everything and I sat for a whole year with my characters and my story. Don't forget, again, this is the story of my family. In an indirect way, it's a story of my father losing his house, my family, my father visiting his house in Jaffa and what happens to him. So it is, even though it's a fictionalized, it's based on true story, but it is at the end of this day, my story in a way. That's number one. So there is a lot of emotions that need to come out. Many times I feel that writing is really a therapy. It's like sitting in front of the therapist and telling them the story that bugs you. Remember, I have been in Palestine for 41 years, and I only had the courage to go and visit my parents' house, my father's house, in 2018, almost 30-some years ago, which meant that I did not have the emotional power, the emotional ability to face an Israeli family living in my own house. So the book is not about the reader or compromising the reader. When we write, I don't think we should have a reader in mind, because the minute you start writing for a reader, I think you have failed as a writer. This is my opinion. And the second thing I want to tell you, and this comes from my political life, nothing to do with writing, that even when I remember at the time discussing things or arguing things with Israelis, the more frank you are with them and you tell them what you think, the more credible they feel. You know what I mean? In other words, people respect you for being courageous. Don't think that people respect you for being cowardly or compromising. And this is what I wanted. I mean, I am writing so I get it out of my system. And also, for me, I think the world doesn't know much of what happened during Nakba. the catastrophe in 1948. I am convinced that people are concentrating on the Jewish side of the story. But what happened to us in 1948, it's true that we Palestinians and Arab know that, but the majority of the West does not know what happened to us during the Nakba, because there is such a strong Israeli machine, publicity machine lying all the time. Starting from a country with no people for a people with no people, with a land with no people. Also, the other thing, sorry, I got emotional, but I just want to tell you another thing. For example, we made the Israelis have this nonsense cliche, we made the desert bloom. First of all, deserts should be respected, should never be blooming. Deserts are deserts. Environmentally should not be changed. But the other thing I want to tell you, that Jaffa had thousands and thousands and thousands of orange groves during the Palestinian era. Go to Jaffa today and show me one tree. They cut all the olive groves in Palestine and in Jaffa. So anyway, coming back to your point, I never think of the reader. The only time I think of the reader when my editor tells me, maybe you should tell us more about Nakba, maybe you should tell us more about ethnic cleansing, maybe you should tell us more about this. I mean, it's when they ask me to explain things, yes, I listen. But I've never been challenged on any of the important issues in my writing. I am lucky that way.
Yeah. Suad, I can keep going. I have so many other questions, but I'm going to stop because I want to give people the chance to ask you questions. But first, we have just a kind of quick wrap up in terms of connecting with you and what you're doing now. And the first thing is to ask you what it is that you're currently maybe reading
Uh-huh. Well, I just finished a book by Sally, by the Irish writer. I am so terrible with names sometimes. It will come Aroni, Sally Aroni, Conversation with Friends. Okay. And it's a wonderful book. I am thinking of second. I just finished it, so I'm thinking of reading Raja Shahadi's diaries. We could have been friends, about his father. His relation, Raja is a Palestinian writer, and I want to dig into his book.
Okay, great. And just so everybody here with us now, this is your chance. If you want to ask Suad anything, you can go ahead and type it in the chat, or just say, I have a question. You can unmute and ask Suad a question. Okay, we have comments. We don't have questions yet, but I'll keep my eye out. Okay, so another question for you, Suad, is maybe you answered this in the second half of what you just said, but if there's a person that you'd like to shadow and just like watch for the day, if you were like this fly on the wall watching what they're doing, past or present, who would that person be? And I wonder if it's a family member, maybe.
No, it would be Bernard Shaw.
Okay. Okay. Why is that?
Because he's so wise and he's so funny and he's so deep at the same time. For those younger people who don't know who Bernard Shaw, I think it might be a good idea to Google him and read a little bit. And I remember as a young girl, when he was, they asked him, what is capitalism? And he was like, he's bald and he had a beard. So he put his hand on his beard. He says, a lot of production and bad distribution. And he puts his hand. This is what came to mind now.
Okay, cool. Salam is with us from Seattle, and she wants to ask you a question. Salam, do you want to unmute and maybe turn on your camera and you get to talk with Suad?
Hi, Suad. So first, I want to say that I love this book so much. Yasmin and I actually book buddy read this together. Yeah, we were sending long voice notes and video messages to each other as we were going through this book. And, I loved it. And I think one of the things that Yasmin and I talked about were just so much of the rich details that were here to really give us an opportunity to sort of visualize this time period. And it was, it's super interesting because I study history a lot. I'm a political scientist by practice, but a historian by passion. And one of the things that I really picked up on, how there were certain zones in Jaffa that were not allowed, Palestinians were not allowed to go to, in sort of the ways in which Zionists and the state of Israel really adopted the colonial policies of Great Britain and then just implemented them in the creation of their own state. But one thing I had a question about, this book is sort of, set in a really, really interesting time period. It's right before the Nakba. But, you talked about that sort of shift, right? You have the Nebi Rubin festival, and then you have the beginning of the war. And I definitely sense, the tone, the changing of the tone as soon as the Nakba took place. But one thing that I kind of found interesting, and I was wondering, like, maybe when you were, collecting this oral history and talking with these people, was there, because in the text from like the Nebi Rubin festival, it seemed like nobody really anticipated what was to come. Right. Despite the rise of the Jewish militias, nobody thought it would get to this level. It would become what it became. Was that the general tone that you got when you were collecting this oral history? Was there anybody like, we could see this coming, or was this just a complete shock for everybody that you encountered and, collected this data from?
Well, it's actually people like now. I'm living in Ramallah and the situation is really bad. Settlers running around, shooting people, throwing stones, taking olive groves, burning olive trees. So it was bad. In Jaffa, pre-1948, it was bad. But if you ask me today, I am sitting in my home in Ramallah, would that come to a point where they will kick us out? And I find myself in some Arab neighboring country or in the sea? No, they didn't expect it. I can tell you that most of our parents, most of them, like everybody, you have wars everywhere in the world. And when you have a bomb coming into your house, it's only natural that you run. You run for your life. This happens in all wars in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq. Unfortunately, we have so many wars in this area. People just go to protect themselves. But nobody thought that they will not be allowed to come back to their homes. And this is the nastiest thing that happened to the Palestinians, that once they were scared and ran away, the Israelis closed the borders and did not allow people to come back. And even those who tried to come back, they were shooting at them. And to make it even more difficult for them, they started destroying. Al-Manshiyah in the book in Jaffa, which is the biggest neighborhood, they completely destroyed it. So even if you came running, you will find just the rubble of your home. Mm-hmm. So they were shocked. I can tell you that I know that my husband's family, for example, the Tamaris, they normally went to Lebanon during the summer, just to have a summer resort in Brummana. And in 1948, they went. And you have to remember, and this is for me is extremely important because there is a misconception about a 1948 war. Let me tell you, there wasn't a 1948 war. There was throwing people, ethnic cleansing before the British left. So we always, even I, thought that really there was a war of Arab armies with Israel, and, as the Israelis always like to say, you lost the war. No, there was the British army, the British rule, the British mandate. Under their supervision, we were kicked out of our homes. Remember, this all happened. All of the big cities and the villages in Palestine were thrown out. The people were kicked out of their homes while the British were here. This happened in April and May and March. And the British mandate ended in April 15, but all of this happened before April 15. So of course people were shocked because you run and you think you will be able, and up till now all the UN resolutions say that we have the ability, we have the right to go back home, but they don't allow anybody to go back home. So of course they were shocked, and I must tell you we are still under shock.
Everybody, just a quick shout out, Suad, not a very long time ago, had joined Instagram, so make sure you go follow her. This is her account. This is Riwaq's account as well. Thank you so much, Suad. This was the most incredible conversation in a very long time.
Thank you, Mikey. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Tamara, and everybody who worked on this.